This is Thomas Tarrant as a young man and how he looks today. Back in the 1960s, as a young man, Thomas Tarrant was a member of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, at the time the most violent terrorist group in the United States. Thomas hated blacks, Jews, communists, socialists, and liberals. He was violently racist and anti-Semitic. One night, Thomas and a colleague attempted to blow up the home of a Jewish businessman, but the police were there to stop them. His accomplice was killed, and Thomas was shot 4 times. He ended up in jail. He escaped. He ended up in jail again, this time in solitary confinement. That was the lowest point of his life, Thomas says. But he didn't change. Not then. Thomas began to read. He read at the start racist and anti-Semitic books, but then philosophy. He realized he was looking for the truth. He says, "Since philosophy didn't possess the truth I was seeking, I was drawn to read the Gospels, where I was encountered by truth himself." Unbeknownst to me, says Thomas, a group of women had read about me in a newspaper and had been praying weekly for 2 years that God would save me and use me for his glory. The leader of this prayer group was the wife of the FBI agent who captured me. Not long after I started reading the Gospels, my eyes began to be opened. One night, I knelt on the floor of my cell and prayed a simple prayer to Jesus, asking for forgiveness and offering my life to him if he wanted it. It felt like 1,000 pounds had been lifted from my shoulders. Something changed inside of me, and I haven't been the same since. I awoke the next day to find that I was now spiritually alive, and God was real to me. I had an immediate appetite to read the Bible, to pray, and to live for God. The more I read the Bible, the more I grew. God gave me love for people I once hated and helped me to change my life in other ways. You can read Thomas's story in more detail in his recent book, Consumed by Hate, Redeemed by Love. I tell you this story, I tell you Thomas's story, because it's an example of a person changed by Christ, transformed by Jesus. A man who realized that he was lost and needed to be found, who realized he was heading for destruction and needed to be saved. In that way, Thomas Tarrant is no different to anyone else, including me and you. We're all lost until we're found and saved by Jesus. But not everyone wants to be saved by Jesus. And that is what Paul is wrestling with in our reading from Romans today. As I talked about 2 weeks ago, Paul's problem is this. Paul's own people, the Jewish people, have rejected Jesus. The very people who should have been watching for the Messiah to come, the King sent from God, they have rejected him. And Paul is devastated by this. It gnaws away at him. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, says Paul. It's fashionable in some places these days to say that Christianity is just one choice among many. That what we believe about Jesus and live in our lives isn't really that important. That ultimately everyone will be saved. And I'd love to be able to tell you that's true. that my friends and family members and your friends and family members who are living life without Jesus, who are doing their own thing, who don't see the point of Christianity, I'd love to be able to tell you that they'll all be fine, that they'll be saved, that they'll be there in God's new world one day. I'd love to be able to tell you that, but I can't, because it's not what we find in the Bible. If it were true that everyone will be saved, then the Jewish people rejecting Jesus shouldn't be a problem for Paul. Paul should relax, knowing that ultimately everyone will be fine. The fact that they've rejected Jesus now, it doesn't really matter. If it were true that everyone will be saved, then Jesus wouldn't say things like this: "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." But what we find in Romans is that Paul is worried about his fellow Jews. And Jesus does warn us that most people will take the road to destruction. It would be brilliant to think that everyone will be saved. But that's just not what we find on the lips of Jesus or in the rest of the Bible. If not everyone is going to be saved, and if we care about people, that means that what we do at St. Faith's really matters. It's important. This message that we have about Jesus is literally life and death stuff. There's an urgency to the gospel message. We need to get the message out. The call to follow Jesus, as Jan was talking about last week, isn't just for the past. It's for people here and now, today, as well. So if you're not a follower of Jesus this morning, you need to be. You need to take seriously Jesus' claim over your life and his warnings about what will happen to you if you don't follow him. But let's come back to Paul. As a whole, Paul's fellow Jewish people have rejected Jesus. And Paul has, as he says, unceasing anguish about this. What's going on? Has God rejected his people? Paul asks in Romans 11 verse 1. By no means, he says. I'm Jewish myself, so God cannot have rejected all his people. In verse 28, he goes on, as regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved. For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. What does Paul mean? Well, we need to think about what happened in those early days after the death and resurrection of Jesus. What happened is this. The Jewish people rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and they persecuted those early Christian believers. And that persecution pushed those early Christians out into the wider world, and they took the gospel with them. And Gentiles, non-Jews, started hearing about Jesus and becoming disciples. Because of the Jewish persecution, the Gentiles heard the gospel. Imagine instead if the Jewish people had accepted Jesus in those early days. If that had happened, Christianity might have remained a Jewish-only faith. The rest of us may never have heard, and the gospel would have been limited to one ethnic group, the Jews. But they didn't accept Jesus. As a whole, the Jewish people rejected Jesus, and because of that, the gospel went out into the wider world. Their rejection has brought the message of life to us, to me and you, to Gentiles. That's why Paul writes, as regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But that does not mean that God has rejected the Jewish people entirely. They too can come back, says Paul, if, like him, they choose to follow Jesus themselves. Verse 32, God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he may be merciful to all. And the all there is Jews and Gentiles. No one is saved, says Paul, simply because of the ethnic group that they come from, or who their family are, or because they live in a certain country. If we are saved, it is because God has chosen to be merciful to us. God has imprisoned all of us in disobedience. All Jews, all Gentiles, you and me, everyone. We are all sinners. He has imprisoned all of us in disobedience so that he can be merciful to all of us. It is God's desire that everyone is saved. He wants to be merciful to every single person. But God will not force himself on us. If we don't want it, if we're not prepared to give up our way of doing things and to trust instead in Jesus and to follow him, then God will respect that decision and let it stand. Not everyone will be saved. But the whole message of the book of Romans is that God has made the first move. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. There is a way to get out of the mess we are in. There is a way to find hope and joy and peace. It's the way of Jesus, the way of choosing the narrow path that leads to life. Paul's fellow Jews have rejected that path, but he prays that they will come back. And we pray that people today, those we know and love, and those we don't, will choose that path as well. And I pray that we as St. Faiths will hold out this gospel, this good news of God's mercy to our town. God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he can be merciful to all. All we have to do is respond and say yes to Jesus.